But I'm Paul Cade. I'm the Wildland Program Manager for Vail Fire. I am also one of the board members for Fire Adapted Colorado. I really appreciate everybody seeing everybody here, and it's great to see everybody in person. I have the distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Mike Caggiano and his panel of experts to discuss potential operational delineations. And with that, I'll hand it off to Mike.
Okay, that sounds great. I'm just going to make sure the folks on the panel who are remote can hear me. So if someone can just turn the video on and off just to make sure the audio is still clear. Okay, perfect.
Hey, Mike, just so you know, we can't see anything. It's just a blank screen on our end.
Yeah, well, if you want to see me, perfect. Great. Okay, cool. So we're all set up there. Thanks everyone for kind of bearing with us. So we have the panel on pods, half of whom are remote, half of whom are here. Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Mike Caggiano. I work with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and among several things, we do a lot of strategic planning, work with land management agencies. We're going to hear from a variety of folks here on the panel. I was not planning on giving a real in-depth kind of overview on what pods is, but I can definitely hit the high notes and scratch the surface. So if you feel like you need a refresher on pods, just raise your hand and I'll get a quick sense of where the audience is at with that. Okay, cool, perfect. So what we're trying to do here, potential operational delineations, is a wildfire planning framework where we try and identify potential control lines on the landscape before the fire starts. These are the man-made and natural control features that firefighters think of and try and use when they're going indirect on a fire. So if they're going indirect, either because they want to for each other's benefit, or because they have to because there's unlimited resources, or because of fire behavior, they back off of these features on the landscape, and that's kind of that planning box. So this is a kind of new take on a very old concept, right? This is how firefighters think when they approach a fire. So what we're trying to do is identify these lines in the pre-season before the smoke is in the air. And if we can identify these lines in the pre-season, it becomes a planning tool, it becomes a communication tool, and those of us who don't have a real in-depth fire knowledge still have a better sense of kind of what that firefighting strategy is. If we get a start here, where might the fire go? Where might we have high likelihood of containing that fire? So that's kind of the brief overview. The way we do this is by using some analytical products. You might hear some of the panel members talk about suppression difficulty index or the potential control line analysis. And in essence, these are fire modeling products where we can get an idea of where on the landscape are we going to have higher or lower suppression difficulty putting that fire out. That's the suppression difficulty index. And the potential control line analysis looks at a similar problem using a different set of data, uses historical fire observation data where fires have and have not stopped in the past, and then it uses that to create a spatial model of where fires are likely to stop or not stop in the future. Do they tend to stop on roads? Do they tend to stop on ridge lines, old fire scars, fuel type transitions? And by combining these analytical products with expert knowledge from those folks who know the landscape the best, from those folks who know about fire behavior in a particular landscape, we can start to kind of leverage these analytical products with that expert knowledge. We can put it on a map. We can get it into a GIS. Once it's there, it becomes a planning tool, a communication tool. We can combine it with other spatial data sets on fire behavior or values at risk. And it can be a great tool to support incident management on active wildfires, a great tool to think through, hey, where does it make sense to treat the landscape from that kind of pre-fire planning tools perspective. So that's a quick overview on pods. Before I introduce the panel, we can take a quick minute and answer any any questions if anyone has any, or we can just dive into a panel. Awesome. So I'm just going to introduce everyone here right off the bat, and then we'll just kind of move from one person to the next. And I asked the panel members to kind of keep it fairly straightforward and short, so we can have some good discussion afterwards. So we have Ali Richards and James White, Brad Pachuska, Cordell Taylor, and Matt Thompson. We're going to hear about like the regional perspective, how Region 2 of the Forest Service is thinking about this, incorporating this into their planning and response efforts from Ali. James White with the Arapahoe Roosevelt is going to talk about his experience with pods, developing them a few years ago, trying to use them now, where he wants to go with that. We're going to hear that kind of same Forest Service local unit perspective from Brad on the San Juan, and then Cordell on the GMUG. And then before we get into our question and answer session and discussion, Matt Thompson with the Rocky Mountain Research Station is going to talk about some of the research and development that is accompanying this process, what might be coming down the pipeline, and then he's also going to hit on some of the national context. We're starting to see this being used more and more on active incidents. Forests and other jurisdictions are starting to integrate this into their plans, and there's even some language in the infrastructure bill and some of the budgets that have some implications for this. So we designed this panel to be kind of well-rounded, Colorado focused, so you all can get a better sense of what this is and how it's being used in different parts of the state. And with that, I'll turn it over to Allison, and you can tell us how the region is approaching this.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. So first, just to start, the Forest Service, we don't have national policy directing the use of pods, but within the region, we've adopted a regional strategy because we see the value here and making sure that we get the region, have those in place so we can start using them in our fire management decisions. So what that looks like for us is we're trying to create a common operating picture of what pods are on all the forests, so that when incident management teams go there to use them or FMOs use them, they've already done some of that pre-planning and collaboration with partners, and they've thought through what the suppression strategies may be out on the landscape before the fire starts. So we've been helping with some workshops as needed. Mostly that's Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. They've been doing the heavy lift on that, working with forest FMOs. So where we're currently at in the region is the Arapahoe Roosevelt has pods. The Pike San Isabel National Forest has pods. San Juan does as well. The Medicine Bow route, they finished their pod workshops last spring, and they got map books produced by CFRI, and they had those in time for fire season this year, and they ended up utilizing those. The Rio Grande National Forest has pod boundaries, but they've determined that they want to go back and take a look at those pod boundaries and PCLs and see if they're still valid or if they need to be revisited with partners. The GMUG has pods and is continuing to refine those. Black Hill National Forest, working with CFRI, they're going to be having pods workshops this October. The White River National Forest and UCR will be hosting pod workshops in November. And the Shoshone Bighorn National Forest in Wyoming, they're going to be undertaking that effort this winter. They're going to be using Mike's guidebook on how to host those workshops on their own. And then the data that comes out of that, CFRI will be producing map books for them. And then the Nebraska National Forest, which is the last remaining forest in the region, they're going to start working on those probably winter, fall of 22, beginning of 23, somewhere in there is I think what we'll get them in. So one of the things that we've learned along the way is for the folks that have had pods previously developed and they're starting to utilize those as they gain experience in engaging with cooperators, some folks are realizing that they may want to update those PCLs and make some changes. And so that's being supported at the region as well through the agreement that we have with CFRI. So Mike's going to be working on that with those folks this winter. The second half.
There you go. Okay.
Oh, do we have? Oh, no, I'm sorry about that.
No,
How
that's
much
okay.
did you miss?
You got through all the forests and you kind of were at, the Nebraska. So
Oh.
I think we're more or less set, but if
Okay.
you have anything else to say, you can jump in and say it.
Okay, I just want to wrap up with the second phase of a regional strategy is then utilization of the pods. And so, Mike, I know we've talked quite a bit about this. What we see next steps is really working with the teams, incident management teams within the region, to start utilizing some of the products on the RMA dashboard, as well as the forests that have pods, to leverage those in their incident response when they're out there. So I know you went to the Sullivan Fire this year on the White River National Forest UCR, and I've talked to several different folks within the region about my personal experience that I had on using those on the Robinson Fire. And I think folks are really starting to see the value of having those products in their hands in real time when they're out on the ground trying to make strategies and tactics out in the field. So I'll leave it at that. I'll turn it back to you. And if folks have questions about what we're going to do within the region, I'll answer those later.
That sounds great. Thanks, Allie. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of run through everyone, and then we'll definitely have some time for some questions afterwards. So thank you so much for that, Allie. Next up, we're going to hear from James. We have the pleasure to hear from him in person instead of on the screen. William?
Well, James White from the Rockwell Roosevelt National Forest, Pawnee National Grassland, Tri-Fire Field Specialist, and really excited to be here and have this conversation, and really looking forward to and learn. I just wanted to focus my experience on the development of the collaboration, the partnership. Again, CFRI, heavy lift, facilitating the workshops, forest-wide, going district by district, and at those events, we would literally throw down a paper map and have equivalent of crayons and markers, and essentially you'd have fire practitioners and forest managers and ecologists all working together to define these delineations on the landscape, and having the initial conversation then when the time limit was really wide and we weren't under the duress of one of the largest fires in Colorado history. So that development through cohesive partnerships, I think, is key. That plays out when the wildfire is present. The smoke and the flames are impending on your communities. It creates a common operating picture. When we're out there and we're having a conversation before and after the wildfire event, the pods have really created a structure that isn't tied to some particular landscape feature from, like a watershed standpoint, which fire obviously moves across the landscape with little impedance based on fences, jurisdictions, and others. So it's just that common operating picture that everybody can speak to and helps compartmentalize the landscape. Very large, vast, and diverse. It's a quick spatial awareness tool. So when Cameron Peak started, it was within the first operational period, it became very obvious that we had a big problem on our hands because the fire had established itself well in 3 of our largest pods of expanses of 20,000+ acres. And at that point, there was very little that you could do based on the terrain, suppression difficulty indexes to get after that. So you have to look at what's that next feature. Well, when something is pushing 60,000 acres of landscape, defining those next features can be challenging when your time width is very, very small. And then, so for the team challenges, to speak specifically with the 10 management teams and 112 days on Cameron Peak, there's a couple things with pods. Pods, you can define those on a map. They become really fat. They look great when you have a fat crayon because it looks like you're really making a new move. But there's a reality to that. It's how much of that linear feature is actually viable, depending on the different conditions for your expected fire behavior, and then what resources you might have. The consideration of whether or not a pod boundary is a standalone, where you can come back after the fact and know that maybe the fire progression has halted at that location, or in many cases, especially where we're at now, and I think this is kind of like, and for all of us, that there's we have to be active. So we can't just sit there and watch the fire hit it. We expect it to do something. We have to actively do something on it. And that's where it comes to that pre-treatment, the planning, and how to prioritize. And again, that's part of the collaborativeness nature of this, is that collaboration on those pod boundaries. Where do we want to focus our limited our limited resources and abilities to get that work done on the ground well before fire season begins, with fire year. You know, it's really helpful in that balance of time and space. And so you may have a pod boundary, we call them dancing pods, and I don't know if we'll speak to that a little bit, but certain pod boundaries will or will not become effective even if they're treated, just because of that time and space consideration. And, you know, I can speak to Cameron Peak. It seemed like always the fire's head would hang up well away from the pod boundary, and there was a necessity to engage and become active on that pod boundary to have any sort of fighting chance. Or in some cases, we're fortunate enough to have enough pre-treatment done, of which I'm going to put in broadcast burning, because that was by far some of the most effective. But again, with limited time and resources, identifying that strategy and utilizing those pod boundaries create something that's meaningful for your partnerships. It's pretty pivotal.
Awesome. Thank you, James. We did capture some really great lessons learned on how pods were utilized on Cameron Peak Fire. If anyone's interested, there's a report up on the CFRI website. Really briefly capturing some lessons learned and some of the recommendations moving forward that James just spoke to. Next, we're going to move to the southwest corner of the state and hear from Brad, and he's going to show us a little bit about how he's incorporating pods into some of his prescribed fire plan. Take it away, Brad.
All right, thanks, Mike. Hey, everybody. My name is Brad Petresco. I'm the Fuels Program Manager for the San Juan National Forest. I'm going to pivot away from incident response and talk a little bit about fuels and other resource planning using pods and some of the stuff we've developed down here. So one sec, I'll share a map and we'll kind of just talk through some stuff. All right, so up on the screen, those black polygons is every prescribed fire unit we have so far across the forest. It's about 200,000 acres. A lot of these were in place before we had pods drawn. A lot of them came afterwards, but I'm just going to show you the general theme here. So here's our prescribed fire units. Then here's every pod that we have across the forest. Pods include our prescribed fire units. It just makes sense to do that. We're going to hold a fire there under conditions we want. It makes sense that sometimes we'll have conditions we want to fire and have an unplanned ignition in there. And then just going a little further, these blue polygons on top are what we're using to prioritize our efforts for the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative, which is a 10-year program of the Forest Service and Wild Turkey Federation, where we try to just achieve better outcomes across a landscape. In this case, all the blue area right there is the RMRI landscape. And so to do that, we started consolidating these smaller pods into a larger group, an RMRI pod. And from there, we worked with our partners, our cooperators, collaborators, in order to make, to rank these things. Where's the most high value for water, recreation, wildlife, fire, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of one way that we used pods. And then I'm going to pivot just a little bit. If you think about a pod, right, it's designed to hold something. It's designed to hold a fire. In the prescribed fire unit case, it's a specific type of fire. In a wildfire scenario, it might be a different sort of fire. But anyway, it's a container. So you can think of them as you want to hold a fire in them, but within these pods, they also hold characteristics about the landscape, and we can leverage that using past prescribed fire data as well as NFDRS and fire behavior stuff to hopefully get a little more insight, even if you're not super, fire analysis savvy. So with that, what we did was kind of went through, and we now have a forest prescription in our pond site for two types of fire, both canopy maintenance, or what we typically call first entry, and then second entry, which we call canopy modification. So we went through, found all of these things, used Fire Family Plus, combined with when we've burned in the past and what the outcomes of those burns were. And you can get a pretty reliable prescription out of that. Now, you can go a step further, and then you can start saying, okay, well, you could just do a fire behavior prescription off of that, since the pods are containers and hold all the fuel in there. Here's an example from the Dolores district. Up top is your canopy maintenance, that first entry one. Goes through, gives you a bunch of different fuel models, kind of laid out similarly to what you'd see in any burn plan you might be familiar with the benefit that this includes crown fire modeling. So most of our burn plans are traditionally surface fire only. Crown fire modeling is incredibly important to fire spread and intensity. So incorporated that in here, and again, used pods for every burn unit. There's a pod downwind of it, so we can classify the landscape based on what that downwind pod is, and then feed that back through the same kind of process we did for the prescriptive limits to give us the maximum fire behavior for outside the unit for things like contingency planning, holding resource organization, things of that nature. So we've got this in place, and we've got all of our Forest Service burns, as well as a couple of BLM ones. They're starting to use this down here as well. So that's all populated here. And then the last thing I'm going to share is this is all forecastable information. So we can look 7 days out, both NFDRS and WIMS, and we already know all the pod info. So it's just a matter of feeding it all together into sort of a real-time decision support toolbox that we're using right now to help us identify burn windows. So you can click through, click your RAWS station anywhere around here, and it'll say potential burn day. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, that's cool. Let's take it a step further. Here's the statistics graph. So just a simple ERC chart. We've kind of identified those upper boundaries for different types of prescribed fire that we want. And then we've also got it linked right back to fire behavior. So if you're still concerned, you can go back in and run the exact same fire behavior equations that your prescription had in it, but you can pick the day you want to do it for. So let's say we're looking at the 26th, which is a Sunday, and Boggy Dry Unit 18. Pick your fuel model, enable crown fire. If you know nothing else, if you don't even know what fuel model, this tells you what the majority is in that area. You can also do it for any pod across our landscape. Here's another one that's in spruce fir. It's saying this area you might want to think about using 5. So it can do that. You can use this for prescribed fires, why it's developed, but again, we have every pod in here because of unplanned ignitions and decision support with those. So we use that pretty routinely. It's also populated with, other little ticklers, CPC outlooks, hot, dry, windy, stuff like that. But that's kind of where we're at down here as far as how we're starting to integrate resource areas with things like RMRI, and then also how we're using pretty common tools on the fire planning side of things like Fire Family Plus, and looping all those back in together, both for prescribed and wildfire. So that's quick and dirty, but I'll turn it back over to you, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Really great stuff. I think that provides a really good, just a quick snapshot of some of the ways folks are starting to use this and incorporate it into existing planning efforts, right? As one consideration among a whole suite of tools that we have, and that was just a great example of how it's being integrated. Next, we're going to hear from Cordell, and he's going to tell us a little bit about pods on the GMO.
Good afternoon. I know some familiar faces. Bill, it's good to see you. Cordell Taylor. I'm the fire staff officer on the just about 45 minutes down the road out of Delta, Colorado. So the GMUG and where we're at, we're a little bit behind Brad in the San Juan. We're a little bit behind James in the ARP as well. We just started last year since COVID really started getting folks together, our counties or EFPC, BLM, and the Forest Service together to talk about pods. And then we started developing lines last October with Mike and a slew of other folks that came in. So what we're going to use it for is, again, the same kind of concepts that Brad talked about, what James talked about, and that is the wildfire risk and pre-planning tools that we can use prior to having a fire, and those starts and where we get starts typically, and we can have those discussions on where is the right ridge, where is the right road to be able to suppress. And it's a risk management tool in that instance. Also, if you're familiar with WFDS, the Forest Service and federal agencies' use of wildfire decision support, we're using that integrated into pods with that as strategic units of boundary areas that we can start the planning process. Those will be our initial planning areas of a fire when we have a start within that pod. The fuel side of the house is going to start using it on strategic and tactical operations, very similar to what Brad shared. We're going to look at those high value risk areas, and we're also going to look at the opportunities to leverage fuels money into Joint Chiefs projects and different land management projects across boundaries, not just Forest Service, but across state, private, and BLM boundaries to implement large fuels landscape restoration work. And then I like what Brad said and what Brad showed. I wish I had some graphs like he does on stacking up those pods and those boundaries with the analysis side of the house. So using IFTDIS or FlamMap or like Brad has integrated ROS stations into other simulations with burn plan, fire behavior type analysis tools, where we can get a sense of how well those first initial stabs at our lines are going to be to either hold a barrier, or even if we do a fuels modification, move it out, say we do a 300-foot off both sides of a road shaded fuel break, is that truly going to hold? And so we can run those models, stack it up against the pod boundaries, and see what our success is potentially going to be. Knowing that, like Brad mentioned, the crown fire data is a little bit different than our surface fire data as well. So it'll be cool as we work with Brad and other forests in the region to kind of nail down some of that analytical stuff. Again, that all hits down to the firefighter out there in the field. What they see out there is we're either implementing it around a wildfire start or a prescribed fire boundary, or just doing field modifications out there. So another part of the pods that really, it's kind of taken it a little bit further. I mentioned the high value risk areas. Once we quantify all of our risk and our values, we'll be able to take that and kind of look at whether or not we need maintenance, such as our Ponderosa ecosystem. Do we need maintenance burning in there, and how frequent that should be, versus our other stands of, aspen. A lot of that needs restoration. Some good fire on the landscape is always what we're trying to promote. So we'll use this tool with pods on that in those areas. And once we restorate, hopefully we can get into or restore, we can get it into a maintenance type burning application. We can also move it into the areas like, say, high value risk areas. We want to exclude fire out of that, and that will help us in our pre-planning efforts going out on fires. That's all I have. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thanks for that. Yeah, and what Cordell was talking about there is We're seeing a lot of folks use pods like containers. Both, I think everyone hit on that, right? Once we know those potential operational delineations, we can combine it with the wildfire risk assessments, other spatial data sets, and then it just adds value as a planning tool. Once again, integrating with and complementing these existing planning frameworks, not really competing against them. We're going to kick this over to Matt Thompson now. Matt was one of the folks who was really instrumental in getting this off the ground a few years ago with his work in the Sierras. And Matt, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Mike. I guess I'll touch on three things here. One being maybe the future of where we might be trying to go in R&D. Two, as I see it anyway, where we're kind of heading in the broader kind of planning and management arenas. And three, as Mike brought up earlier, putting on, looking through the crystal ball rather and seeing what might be coming down with broader legislative action. So first, R&D, I think James alluded to this earlier. I think a clear need and a clear opportunity is to have these models be more dynamic, be more responsive to changing conditions. A lot of the analytics that are provided in real time for fires through risk management assistance program or pre-positioned through pods and drawing of the lines are fairly static. And Mike and his team have pushed the envelope forward by building these pod atlas tools that have fire behavior under a range of fire weather scenarios. And so that's beginning to move the needle to show under what conditions might these lines hold or what sort of fire behavior might you expect. But I think there's opportunity to kind of keep pushing the envelope there, both in terms of likelihood of control, in terms of where it would be unsafe to engage or unwise, perhaps, from a combination of low likelihood of success with increased exposure or hazard to fire responders. So, and that gets at that dancing pods idea, which is really, instead of just a static map, it may actually be kind of a map that changes as conditions change, not only in terms of where control opportunities and where those containers truly lie, but also in terms of the risk assessment. A lot of the risk assessment work is kind of averaging across a range of fire weather and fire behavior conditions, such that one pod may show up as beneficial fires expected, but not when conditions are burning really hot. So that ability to kind of shift not only strategies and tactics for response, but getting at the big why. Where do we want fire, why, and under what conditions? So that's number one. Number two, on the management side, I think the take-home point is just we're really trying to emphasize stronger integration, and integration in a couple of areas. I think Cordell and others talked about integration with existing platforms and systems. So I think you're going to see next-gen WFDS, the Wildland Fire Decision Support System, provide more functionality so that it can house pods and strategic response zones. Maybe we'll be moving in that direction with IFTDIS, the Interagency Fuel Treatment Decision Support System. There's a clear alignment with risk management assistance, which is basically providing incident management teams and local managers with that sort of same set of information upon which pods are built. So I think they're going to start blending more and more together. This year alone, we got an email this morning. There's been support for about 111 fires just in 2021 alone, up from 11 fires in 2016. So I think there's this growing demand, like Ali was alluding to. But also kind of this more kind of social integration. And this again is where I think CFRI has really been a huge asset to this, that kind of social cross boundary. So we're building out these communities of practice. We're trying to really engage, for example, with folks who work in the shared stewardship coordination offices, with the collaborative forest landscape restoration, with cohesive strategy coordinators. So I think that will be really valuable. And then third, time to peer through the crystal ball. For those who don't know, the infrastructure bill that is not fully passed, and who knows what's going to happen on the Hill, that of course is always hard to predict, but the language as written provides $100 million for, among other things, doing pod workshops as well as workshops to identify these potential control locations. And so that's 50 million for USDA and 50 million for DOI. And we're at the very nascent stages of conversations with DOI Office of Wildland Fire as well as USGS about how this might look. That's a huge influx of money. And the question is, how is it going to be allocated? What is the color of money? To what purposes can we put it? You can envision additional capacity for analysts. We need 15 more people who do the work that Brad does at a minimum. You can imagine facilitators. That's a really critical role. You can imagine, extension services and outreach and building the sort of cookbooks that Mike has been doing. You can imagine even funding more social science. How is this information being digested? Are there better ways to communicate? Are there better ways to present information to incident management teams? So, we're very much in the brainstorming phase of what that looks like. One last point, it's actually bigger than just that $100 million, because elsewhere in the infrastructure bill language, it allocates $500 million for developing or improving potential control locations. And the language of the bill actually explicitly refers back to the money for potential control locations workshops. So there's this intentional synergy in both the design and workshop and planning of where you could identify potential control locations. And then there's 10 times that amount of money to developing and improving potential control locations. It could be strategic fuel break systems or other forms. And so, how and whether we can best capitalize on the work that James and Brad and Cordell just talked about, as using pods not only as a way to think about incident response, but to think about landscape scale strategies for containment and strategic restoration with control in mind, I think is where this is all going. And how do we spend $600 million is a question that I don't know the answer to, but it's probably a better problem to have than having $0 to figure this out. So thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Matt. That's really helpful for folks to kind of hear that the big picture perspective. I'm going to ask that the online panelists, Matt, Brad, Ali, if you could turn your video on, that'd be great. We do have, by my count, about 13 minutes or so left for questions. So happy to, if anyone in the audience has questions for any of the panelists, or if any of the panelists have questions for the panelists, let's try and answer this. So someone has a question. Would you get us kicked off on it, please?
Thanks. Good. Question I have for Brad, James, and Cordell is, to what extent are non-federal partners part of the table and shaping the how are they also partnering in terms of pre-planning, directive field production?
Yeah, why don't we give James an opportunity to start, and then we can go to Cordell and Brad if you want to jump in there as well.
Mike, just real quick, if you could repeat the questions for us, we can't hear what the answer is.
Thanks for that, Brad. The question that was asked by Tony was to what extent are non-federal partners involved in the pod planning process? Is that an accurate summary, Tony?
Yeah, or just even non-forces.
Yeah, non-forces. Adjacent landowners. What's that cross-boundary aspect of it? Want to start us off, James?
Yeah, so for the initial workshops, it was bringing, we had a scholarship collaborative together, which was a great thing because there's a lot of partners already there and active. And so we used that group and then expanded that out to some of the protection districts and brought them to the table. And the DFPC, all of these folks that have, there are practitioners or have some sort of, their hands in wildfire management to the table, and worked our way kind of around the horn, we call it, to make sure that we capture, those folks that contribute to and contribute to that initial designation or delineation. Right? And then now in our planning projects, where those pods are now translating into our current planning projects at the landscape scale and having those similar conversations. And then asking the question, are they still relevant? Do we need to modify them? If so, where? And then it helps feed into our strategy as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, James. Cordell, you want to talk a little bit about how you're engaging interagency partners with this effort?
Very similar, James. So
when we started our efforts, we got with, like Scott from the Johnson wildfire area. We've got with the Western Region Wildfire Council as well, to bring in a lot more information about those homeowners, homeowner associations, CWP type. They really act in their interest as well. Again, we're still in the line drawing phase. So every year from here on out, until probably forever, until something else comes along, we'll be continuing with discussions throughout. Ryan was at one of the workshops, I do believe, and Lou Godum and Tanner Hutt and Charles in the next group with the FTC. But yeah, all the partners are at the table. And we want to know the concerns out there from all of the other folks. We're not paying attention. The other thing within the federal side that we're bringing in too is our different functional areas. So we've got range, we've got wildlife, we've got archaeology folks that are looking at some of the values that are important to them, along with just not just private land or structure.
Thanks for that. So Brad, if you want to jump in and also answer that question, we'd love to hear that perspective on it.
Okay, as far as involving our partners and cooperators, Mike actually came down and hosted the first pods workshop that we had a few years ago. So we had a number of people in the rooms, county ranchers, fire chiefs, actually quite a few folks, and they helped in a lot of cases draw a ton of lines that aren't on just green or yellow or a property boundary, because those are often not where you're going to hold a fire. Now our burn units definitely are. We do have widened agreements in some areas that we'll burn private under an agreement with that landowner. But from a pods perspective, we have pods that go off the forest. In other places right off the forest, there's a subdivision. And so it's at a minimum, you know, a good conversation to have with those county folks is, okay, there's a fire, it's coming off the forest and we know it's not stopping at the boundary. Why don't we talk a little bit about that right now instead of when this actually happens? Because it's a win. It's not a or not it won't. So just getting them involved in really, I think the most valuable thing, whether your pod lines hold or not, or if they're drawn right through the middle of the subdivision, is at least you have that conversation to anchor future talks to, and the stress level might be quite a bit higher than the preseason or post when you're drawing pods.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brad. Any more questions? Happy to. Okay. Yeah. Allie, the question was reposed to you from the regional perspective. Again, how is the region planning on engaging with its interagency partners, the other federal agencies, state, local, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So far, you know, we've been working with forest FMOs who've really been the ones reaching out to partners. So at the regional office, you know, I have not been working with counterparts at the regional level regarding this. Mostly all that has been done at the regional or at the local level. And so folks were, you know, wondering who they needed to be reaching out to. CFRI has been helping guide some of those conversations, or doing even some information sessions with local stakeholders. Like, for example, on the Black Hills National Forest, when we had a consultation meeting with them about what their workshops would look like, Mike offered up his services to talk to partners prior to the workshop so that they could understand the process and, you know, their involvement in it. To this point, they have not taken us up on that, but that's one of the things that we would be doing from the regional level. But everything that we've seen thus far is really where the rubber meets the road, and those relationships out on the ground.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that, Allie. I will also take a stab at answering that one. We have engaged with Region 2 of the Forest Service, the state of Colorado, the Rocky Mountain area coordinating group, which is a representative body of those state and federal agencies have fire management responsibility. And then here coming up in December, we're actually doing the joint pods workshop with the White River and the UCR. Right? So it is extending that onto on the BLM round. Right? This has a lot of value when it's interagency and cross boundary, and admittedly less so when we kind of restrict ourselves to those jurisdictions. So really happy to see this is taking on kind of more of that interagency perspective.
Yeah, I'll just have one go back. That was only my personal experience. Like you said, Mike, that coordination has been happening, and CFRI has really taken the lead for us on the region, having put money into that agreement. So from my perspective, I primarily just work with Mike and the forest FMOs, and those are the folks that really have the relationships out on the ground.
I can't stress how valuable it is to have these conversations. Because a common operating picture, when you throw a map down onto the hood, when you have a large fire and you've already got an agreement as to where you collectively thought that there was action. You can have a conversation where you compare the two, even though you might not have all their analytics at your fingertips, you can at least have, you're starting off with a trust that you collectively that brought us here to this hard conversation between this location versus. It's great that it happens.
There's so much pressure when that fire starts, smoke in the air. So just having these conversations beforehand, helping those after the fire starts conversations that much. Yes, Bill.
Just a comment, the success of an incident management team development almost always correlates directly. But it's a simple truth, but I think it's important to keep that inside the value.
Yeah, that's a good point. Were you folks able to hear that comment? So what Bill was saying was that the success of the incident management team really depends on the pre-work that has happened on the local unit and that surrounding collaborative. If you have your ducks in the road beforehand, it makes the job of the incident management team and those agency administrators that much easier. Yeah. That's a great point, Bill. Thank you. We're just about out of time, but the three of us will be here for a little while. And if anyone has any additional questions afterwards or any of the panelists, please come find me and I can get in touch with them. And I'm happy to talk about this all day long. So come find me. Just want to give a big shout out to all the panelists in person and virtual, and Paul and everyone for helping ensure this went really smoothly. But thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.